The Australian Open made a huge mistake with Alexandra Eala as she loses first-round match. Alexandra Eala was among the players to be disappointed early in Melbourne after she lost her opening match at the Australian Open. World number 49 Eala was beaten 6-0, 3-6, 2-6 by American Alicia Parks in the first round of the Australian Open. But perhaps more noteworthy than the match itself was the huge crowds which gathered to watch fan favourite Eala in action. The first-round clash took place on Court 6 at Melbourne Park, with her followers making huge noise after packing into the venue, while many more watched on the screens around the grounds. The Australian Open should have given Alexandra Eala a bigger court. Of course, planning a Grand Slam schedule is not an easy feat, particularly with the constant variables at play. But Australian Open organisers could have at least anticipated the mega following Eala would be in for, particularly in her first match. In that regard, the WTA Tour rising star should have definitely been playing her opener on a show court at Melbourne Park. Eala has proven more popular than Carlos Alcaraz lately, with her pre-tournament press conference currently at 175,000 views on the Australian Open's YouTube channel. It is a lesson that organisers of the Grand Slam and indeed the French Open, Wimbledon, and the US Open can undoubtedly learn from going forward. Alexandra Eala has another chance at Australian Open glory. Intriguingly, Eala still has a chance at Australian Open success, and fans have another chance of seeing her in action. The Filipina ace is committed to playing doubles at the tournament, linking up with Brazilian Ingrid Martins. The pair have been drawn to face Magdalena and Shuko Aima in the first round, with the meeting interestingly set to take place on Court 12. Huge crowds can be expected for the match once again, with Eala set to be desperate to right her wrongs from singles. It remains to be seen how that will go. But one certainty is that she is one of the biggest stars in tennis right now, despite only being 20 years old. A first-round silence. How the Australian Open misread Alexandra Eala. The Australian Open prides itself on being the Happy Slam, a tournament that celebrates sunshine, opportunity, and the promise of new beginnings. Every January, Melbourne becomes a stage where legends defend their legacies and young players test the edges of their courage. Yet sometimes, in the rush to crown champions and sell stories, the tournament stumbles. In the case of Alexandra Eala and her first-round exit, the mistake was not simply about a loss on the scoreboard. It was about how promise was framed, handled, and quietly set aside. Alexandra Eala arrived not as a finished product, but as a question mark brimming with potential. She carried the weight that modern tennis places on young talents, the hunger of a new generation, the expectations of a nation still carving its space in the global tennis conversation, and the quiet pressure of being labeled the future before the present has fully arrived. For a player like Eala, a Grand Slam is not just a tournament. It is a classroom, a proving ground, and sometimes a mirror that reflects both strengths and vulnerabilities. The Australian Open's first mistake was mistaking potential for readiness. In today's tennis ecosystem, hype travels faster than development. A junior champion or rising tour player is quickly transformed into a headline, a narrative hook, a social media graphic waiting to be shared. The Open leaned into that impulse. Eala's presence was treated as a moment rather than a process. The spotlight was turned on brightly, but the conditions beneath it were unforgiving. Grand Slam first rounds are ruthless. There is no easing into the tournament, no gentle introduction to the speed and physicality of the highest level. The margins are thin and the experience gap is wide. By placing Eala directly into this environment without the buffer of time, narrative patience, or realistic expectation, the tournament effectively asked her to perform a miracle instead of play a match. When the miracle did not come, the silence that followed was telling. Another mistake lay in the framing of the loss itself. A first-round defeat for a young player should be contextualized as part of growth. Instead, it often becomes a verdict. The Australian Open, like many major tournaments, has a habit of moving on quickly. Cameras shift, headlines evaporate. The story becomes not about what was learned, but about who advances next. For Eala, the loss felt less like a chapter and more like a door closing too quickly. There's also the question of environment. The Australian Open is a spectacle. The heat, the crowds, the noise, the constant presence of expectation. For seasoned professionals, this chaos is familiar territory. For a young player still calibrating her game, it can be overwhelming. If the tournament truly aims to nurture the future of tennis, it must ask whether it is providing stages or simply spotlights. One reveals growth, the other exposes flaws. Eala's match lost in the opening round was not a failure of talent. It was a collision between ambition and reality. The Australian Open prides itself on being the happy slam, a place where sunshine, innovation, and opportunity collide at the start of every tennis year. Yet every so often, beneath the bright Melbourne sky, a decision is made that casts a long shadow over the tournament's ideals. The handling of young talents is often where these shadows grow longest, and in this imagined round one drama, Alexandra Eala stood right at the center of it. This was not merely a match lost on the scoreboard. It was a moment where preparation, perception, and pressure combined into a perfect storm, turning promise into frustration before the tournament had even found its rhythm. A rising star meets a relentless stage. Alexandra Eala arrived at the Australian Open carrying more than a racket bag. She carried expectations, some fair, some wildly inflated. As one of the most recognizable young names from Southeast Asia, she symbolized a future the sport desperately wants: global, diverse, and youth-driven. Her junior success and steady climb through the professional ranks had marked her as a player to watch, even if she was still learning the unforgiving rhythms of Grand Slam tennis. But Grand Slams do not reward potential, they reward readiness. And that is where the first blunder quietly took shape. Instead of being eased into the tournament ecosystem, practice court familiarity, media management, realistic match scheduling, Eala was thrust into a round one scenario that felt less like an opportunity and more like an ordeal. The Australian Open, intentionally or not, treated her presence as a storyline before treating her as a competitor. The weight of a wildcard mindset. The blunder was not necessarily in offering Eala a chance, but in how that chance was framed. Whether through a difficult draw, a marquee court assignment, or relentless pre-match hype, the tournament atmosphere seemed to scream, "Prove you belong, now." For a young player, this can be devastating.